This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Hello, and welcome to Teachers Talk Radio. Today is Friday, October 25th, the lunch show with Morgan Whitfield and Todd Brennan. Today, our guest is AEN Director Ian Young. We will be discussing SEN interventions and how to gain genuine buy-in from students. Listen, text in, and enjoy the show.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Hello, it's lovely to welcome everyone to our Friday lunch show. Todd, how are you doing?
Doing really well, Morgan. How are you?
Yeah, lovely. I think it's just that lovely time of year when we're finally into the proper school year. Everyone started. Everyone feels like they're on top of everything. You know all the students now. So it is a nice time of year to actually get to this topic, actually, I feel.
Absolutely. And a really good time to reflect on it as well, because I think what we're going to talk about today is turning some of that documentation into the practical implementation. And I think we know our students at this time of year. We've seen some documentation around them very early on in the year and started to piece it together. But I think today is really about that, taking it onto that next stage of actually what that practically looks like and how best to support the young people that are in our care. So I think this is excellent timing. Accidental, but excellent timing.
Yeah, I think it is really right. So our topic today is actually really fascinating. We're going to be looking at SEN interventions. And I think that at the beginning of the year, we settle in our students, we see the stars on a register, we read IEPs, we get to know these students a little bit, and we start to kind of make accommodations that we feel are best. And I think that a lot of the times we think that we're on the right track because we are following what is written down for us. And I think what we want to attack in this show is how we can go that little bit further and make sure that those interventions are actually truly embedded, that they are something that is a lived experience for the students who are going through those interventions and living them on a day-to-day basis. So if they are invested in them, that's when we're going to see an impact. And to start us off today, what I really wanted to do was to introduce Ian Young. So Ian is absolutely incredible. He is currently a whole school director of additional learning needs at one of the premier British schools in Southeast Asia. He's worked in Canada, which is why you will recognize his beautiful Canadian accent, the UK, Malaysia, and Vietnam. He's one of the most knowledgeable and insightful pedagogical leaders that I've ever met. He's someone who really interrogates the research. I feel like I met Ian before I met Ian because we exchanged a long series of emails where we were talking about adaptive teaching. He loves his job, and I feel like that really, really comes through. So Ian, it is so wonderful to welcome you on the show today.
I mean, how do you follow that introduction? Thank you very much.
So Ian, when we talked about you coming on, we had all kinds of things that we wanted to discuss, but in the end, you were really passionate that we start looking at genuine engagement and how important that was. And that really came out of some action research that you did. Do you want to start off by just telling us about your action research?
Yeah, sure. So at the school, we had action research as one of the CPL routes. And so it sort of was born actually out of a corridor conversation. You know, you're not supposed to talk about students in the corridors, but we were talking about a class and how we recognized that even though we had some students that were benefiting from additional time, we talked more broadly about, was it possible to give all students in a class additional time? And well, my instinct and reflex as an SEN coordinator is to say, no, they need to be assessed. There's a whole body of research and around like what assessments need to be conducted and what you need to do first. But then we put the conversation on hold. But later we decided to conduct an action research experiment looking at, well, can we give all students additional time and see sort of what happens if we do so? Now, naturally, we couldn't just give everyone additional time. That would disadvantage some classes and advantage others. But so we created a system where all students would have access to an additional 25%. And what they would do in that additional time is just sort of switch pens, write in a different color, and then try to keep going and see what more they could do. Almost as an afterthought, when we were trying to see if students would engage with this, we did a survey before this, asking students what they thought about additional time in general and what their feelings were about that intervention. Is it helpful to them? Do they believe it's something that's more helpful generally? And while we found that, yes, there were a lot of students that we didn't previously identify that used and benefited from additional time, there was also, we also found that there was a strong correlation between those students who said they would benefit or believed in the intervention and those who actually made use of it and gained, additional marks or would have gained additional marks in that added time. So it really struck us that, it seemed as though those students who genuinely believed in or bought into the intervention in the first place were the ones who were more likely to use it and to use it successfully.
That actually makes a lot of sense intuitively that oh, I think that this time is going to benefit me, so I'm going to actually maximize it. So there is kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy that happens there.
Absolutely. And, we saw this also on a smaller scale when we looked at students' interventions students we were working with within the department. If students were genuinely engaged and bought into the intervention, they were more likely to use it and to apply it. It was only after we sort of saw this result that I really started digging into some of the research around, like, why does that happen? How can we generate this quote unquote buy-in? How do we get students to engage in these interventions? We know they're research informed. It's such a shame that not everyone can make use of them. And how can we maximize the impact of those interventions? So we started looking into features and facets and things that might drive it. Because, as you said, Morgan, it is intuitive. We see it all the time. And so it's about how we can potentially harness that.
It's really funny. The very first thing I kind of want to ask is just from like your own experience, do you find that there are some students that are disengaged with intervention? So you go through all the trouble of being assessed. You have these long discussions as part of like a larger team. Then you have discussions with individual teachers. And then you come up with this personalized plan for students. What stops them from actually getting involved authentically in an intervention or with some of the strategies that you were kind of offering up for them as something that they should pursue? Like, what are the barriers there that would disengage them and kind of make those kind of lose impact?
Well, I think what we ended up seeing is what you were alluding to earlier. Some of the things we saw intuitively and in our experience sort of bore out in the research when we dug into it a little bit more. One of the main things is understanding. And having worked with a lot of students who had educational psychologists report that if you've ever read one, I'm sure you have reams and reams of recommendations and interventions. Very few of them actually work and they get applied. And you'll see in those settings, sometimes students aren't involved as much as you'd like them to be. And that was a key element of the research and of, getting students to buy in was, do they understand it? And more importantly, do they understand the potential benefit to them? So it's not just knowing the steps and knowing the way there, but knowing that it's going to have a positive impact. One of the other key components is something that the people who made the CURP, which is a intervention model assessment, they identified an area called, or what they call feasibility. And that basically refers to how feasible is the intervention to that individual or to the student. Is it something that they feel they can implement in their day-to-day life? The more that the intervention has an impact, the less likely that individual is to engage. This sort of came through from medical research as well. When doctors were trying to implement interventions or medical interventions, they were finding that not everybody that they were making these medical interventions and recommendations to were actually following up and implementing those suggestions and interventions. And sometimes it was because of how feasible it was for them to implement. For students, it takes on a slightly different dimension. They're a lot more concerned with social relationships, and this is also what the research bore out. So the more an intervention will make them stand out and appear different, it has a greater impact on their day-to-day in the classroom, the less likely they are to use it. I've always had a difficulty getting students to use speech to text and text to speech. The reason being because it's a program, students might have to use headphones, they might have to speak into their computer. Unless they're doing it in a separate environment, which potentially makes it more feasible, they're less likely to use it because they appear different, they seem different. It's less feasible, therefore, in their mind because it impacts on their ability to fit in and be, just one of the other students.
That's a lot to unpack. There's so much there. I think
Yeah.
when you were first talking, the first thing that I thought was about like dead docs and how like there are some documents that are dead documents. So when you talked about educational psychologist reports or assessments that have reams and reams of suggestions for strategies, but for one reason or another, that might not appeal to a teacher, a parent, or the student themselves isn't really presented or have an understanding of what that strategy might look like. And sometimes it can be a lot of paperwork, but not a lot of action that actually comes to fruition in the classroom, which I think is really fascinating. And the second thing, which I think is really true, is the social relationships in the classroom, and that there is that feeling, especially in adolescence, about feeling different and sticking out in some way. So the feasibility of some of these interventions would actually be quite impacted. Todd, what are your thoughts just kind of listening to this?
Yeah, so I suppose I was just contemplating whether that's the start point then is what the student actually feels they want and what they feel they need. Is that where you tend to start, Ian, with that initial conversation with the student? What is it that you feel you need from us and from these interventions? Because it strikes me that if that was the start point, then everything else naturally would fit into place. Could you speak a little to that, where the student comes in at the start of the conversation?
Yeah, and I'll actually say that's not where I previously would have started. And going back to what Morgan said about EdSci reports, I mean, this might be just my personal opinion. At least previously, you'd get the sense that sometimes there'd be just a bunch of interventions thrown in, and throwing things at the wall and seeing if they stick, without much consideration really for the person it was being applied to. It was almost like a standard format that some were using with just the same interventions for the same challenges, and that obviously wouldn't generate buy-in. So I would say, yeah, I mean, you do want the student involved from the get-go to build that understanding, and to build that understanding of what the benefit is. You need them there from the start. You need to explain it to them in their language. You also need to make sure that it's not going to have them stand out and appear different. So hearing them out in terms of what might be feasible and what might work for them is going to be really important at that early stage. Now, students sometimes just want to please their teacher, and I've had situations before where a student will say yes, I'll do it, and they're kind of lying to your face because maybe they like you as an individual, maybe they just want to please you, maybe they just want to feel like they're doing the right thing. So sometimes you have to dig a bit deeper, and sometimes it might be trial and error, where you implement an intervention and you learn it wasn't feasible afterwards. And that's sort of part of that assess, do, plan, review model that a lot of SEND programs use. And so you do have to just, even if they're involved from the outset, you kind of do have to keep going back and reviewing and checking. We had students, speaking of access arrangements, one particular story is a girl who just did not want her additional time, just refused again and again, no matter how much, it would benefit her. Her paper was always getting turned in right at the time so she could leave with everybody else. And so it took a long time of working with her and actually allowing her to choose not to have the intervention, and then talking to her afterwards about the impact, how it was affecting her, how it was affecting her results, how she could do better if it weren't for. And after a lot of back and forth and a lot of review, genuinely she acknowledged that, yeah, actually, I do need this additional time. It is something that's helpful to me, and it's something that I want to use to make me more successful as a learner. That took years. So involving students from the beginning is important, but sometimes, these things take time. And even with something like feasibility, you might not get it right on the first go.
Yeah, and you've very much reminded me of a student I worked with a long time ago now, who, when I asked him why he'd agreed to the intervention, I was part of the sort of the pastoral team that was discussing this with him before it started. He said, "Because I wanted you all to stop talking and go away." And then when asked why he didn't like it in the classroom, he was like, "I don't need everybody else knowing that I'm different." He was
Yeah.
willing to accept, yeah, I get it, I'm ASD, I think was the diagnosis at the time. I get that I think differently. I get that I find these social situations difficult, but I just don't want a teacher hanging around me in the classroom, making me feel different and letting everyone know that I'm different. And yeah, that I wanted you to go away comment, I always think about that. He was so funny because he just told you exactly what he was thinking. And you're reminding me very much of him actually with his example there.
I mean, you can't underestimate the power of a student wanting to get out of a meeting, whether it's PTSD or otherwise, and it speaks to that sort of stress of the situation and just wanting to exit yourself or get out of there. Maybe it's fight, flight, or freeze, or I might be misapplying that. But in any case, and that's a worthwhile factor considering, what also is the environment that's going to get students to talk about what they need and that support. And sometimes another element that I've looked at quite a lot when looking at buy-in is trust and the individual and the medium very much being the message. If you are a virtual unknown to that student, you come in toting the most latest research informed interventions. They're great. They work on paper. Think about it from your own perspective as well. If somebody came into a room that you had no idea, you didn't trust them, you didn't know them, you had no relationship, and they were recommending something, you'd be a bit skeptical at first. So the relationship you have with that individual, as in your anecdote, Todd, matters a lot as well, because then they'll tell you the truth. Then they'll tell you potentially what they need a bit more and what's feasible and what's not.
Yeah,
I think it's really interesting just kind of listening to kind of two kind of things crossed my mind. The first was just the most simple accommodation in the world has to be extra time, more time. And it's so common. But I know of times in my teaching career where I've been like, here's the end time for the test that's on the board. The assessment ends at 10:30, and then it ends at 10:45 for Tommy and Janine. And right there's 15 minutes where everyone is just waiting quietly for Tommy and Janine. And for those kids under those conditions to have to see that they're the ones that everyone else is waiting for before they can talk, before they can actually move again, before they can relax because the test conditions are over. That's really, really stressful. And it's such an easy way to stand out. And it's just so visible, so very, very visible. So it takes a lot of confidence, I think, as a student to own that time if that's the accommodation that's being given you. The second thing is...
Oh, sorry, Morgan. I was going to say one thing quickly. It sort of speaks to how the environment can affect feasibility as well. And what we did was we started to move all students with extra time into a separate setting. So they were all leaving at the same time. They all had 25% additional time. No one stood out that way. They all had the same adaptation. So everyone was more comfortable sticking around, because I had the exact same experience that you did, where the additional time students would leave as soon as everyone else did because they didn't want to stand out and appear different. So the environment, and we talked about this, Morgan, in relation to adaptive teaching, which you might be leading into as well, having that adaptation also apply to more and being applicable to more individuals in the room can make it also more acceptable and feasible.
Yeah,
definitely. I was just thinking, oh, sorry, Todd.
No, I was just going to say, I've seen it done really well where they get the chance to leave with everyone else, but they leave to a different part of the school, and it was really carefully orchestrated so that it fit with the exam the exam guidance, but they actually just left when everyone else, so none of their peers noticed, but they were actually walking with a teacher along a totally different corridor. Now that's obviously an environmental and a building one, but it just gave them that chance to move around, have a little bit of a break, but also not have that big feeling of difference. Now, not every school could do that and follow the exam policies, but it was really beautifully done. That was a school in the UK, and just something as small as that tiny little adaptation, makes a big difference, I think, to students.
Yeah, we
I
have
think it's
our
really
exams are on floor. Our students line up on floor number 4, but our students with adaptations and extra time all go up early to floor 5, so they get in first and they get to sit down. They don't have the experience of having to walk with everyone else and feeling like, they're splitting off to the exam room that are for people with additional time.
I think it's really interesting because I think that that's kind of like maybe the first phase of steps. So this idea of, oh, we're going to make it less noticeable that you have this adaptation, for instance. I think what's really interesting is my one of my sons. He has an IEP. He's so lovely. But one of the things that I love the most about him is that he is so proud of being neurodivergent, and I think that
Mm,
he's growing up in a generation of students where there's Odd Socks Day, where he's really proud about how he thinks differently, where it is just more normalized. He doesn't feel like he's the only one in this situation. And because it's a point of pride, and I think that there's more, I don't want to say acceptance, but more a celebration around these different adaptations, that maybe it's
mhm.
not something where it's going to be so much segregate and separate people who need things a little bit differently. And that's what I'm hoping it kind of works towards eventually. But that means that you need a high trust environment of psychological safety,
Yeah.
where peers are very accepting and again encouraging of other peers, when it comes to these situations. What are your thoughts about us getting there?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, from our school, I mean, we concluded our neurodiversity week just before the half term, and that's a massive part of making sure that students can engage in these interventions is that general feeling of acceptance. And if neurodiversity is normal, quote unquote, and I do use that term with some reluctance, if that's normal, then it's more accepted and it's more okay to use interventions and adaptations because the idea behind it, the idea of neurodiversity, is broadly accepted and not seen as unusual or different or as standing out. So celebrating and understanding more broadly, I think, does help in this process of having students engage in interventions. Like if everybody, I'm trying to think of an analogy, everybody goes to the doctor and they don't think that's unusual. So, you don't say, oh, I went to the doctor and that's a strange thing and you stand out and you'd be different. I actually kind of lost my train of thought with that anecdote, I'm afraid.
No, I think that's fine. Actually, let's get us back on the train of thought. We'll get on the caboose of your train of thoughts just after this ad break.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Are you a teacher who has concerns about your students' low reading levels? Are you also worried disadvantaged students won't be able to catch up? The online reading development program, Dreambox Reading Plus, adapts to a student's skill level, accelerates reading progress, and helps students acquire a wide vocabulary. The patented technology develops reading fluency and supports the transition to increased text complexity from Key Stage 2 to Key Stage 3 and 4, where language and vocabulary are more challenging. You can try the program with a free 4-week pilot today. Search Reading Solutions UK to find their website and request your free pilot.
How do we stop teachers marking books on their kitchen table on a Sunday night instead of wanting to spend time with their family? Is live marking truly cutting-edge practice? What if I told you that I could provide evidence of verbal feedback and its impact on student outcomes. Now, traditional marking, time and time again, is reported as the number one reason why teachers leave the profession. It trumps behaviour issues and teacher salary. In Guide to Feedback, I share 9 case study skills that demonstrate 9 different ways to provide marking and feedback, all evidenced by student outcomes. Now, not every school will be ready for this, but hopefully you are ready to start your Feed Up and Feed Forward journey.
The Teacher Toolkit Guide to Feedback is out now, and you can get an exclusive 30% discount when you order Teacher Toolkit Guide to Feedback from Bloomsbury.com. Just use the code TTRGTF at the checkout. That's TTRGTF, and it expires 30th of November. Happy reading.
Do you ever wish you could sit down with other teachers and delve into the challenges and opportunities we face? Well, that's exactly what Table Talks at Bet UK is all about. Join small roundtable discussions based on your selected topics to share insights, learn from peers, and tackle the big issues in education, all in a sponsor-free environment. This is your chance to connect and collaborate like never before. Be part of the conversation at Bet UK in January 2025. Visit uk.betshow.com to learn more.
Welcome back, everyone. We are getting right back into SEN interventions and how to make them kind of something that a student is genuinely engaged with. Now, the question that I wanted to add on before we kind of discussed about a little bit about adaptive teaching is I wanted to know about the difference between a primary and secondary student. I think that there are lots of cases where in a primary school, interventions can be a lot easier because you have the same teacher, it's the same set of students that you're familiar with, and they know you really, really well. Whereas when you come to secondary, there's all kinds of change and inconsistency at a time when you're already perhaps a little bit less confident in yourself because you're growing up. So as you're coming of age and you're going through a kind of an identity crisis, at the same time, you are meeting lots of different teachers who might not know your preferences or your strategies, sitting in different parts of the classroom with different students every single day. It can just be a lot harder, I think, for a student to assert themselves, maybe feel like they have agency over the interventions. And perhaps this is where we might be missing the trick. Ian, what are your thoughts on that transition?
Well, I mean, definitely from what you mentioned on the outset of, having that many teachers and having that many teachers apply the same interventions and understand them is going to be a really, really challenging thing. And it's why we expend so much effort in letting teachers know what adaptations are, speaking to them in induction, speaking to them in inset, making our staff available to reach out to teachers, even being in their classrooms to help provide that sort of a greater level of understanding at the classroom level. So I do think that's a hurdle that is difficult to overcome when it comes to secondary students. And were you talking about transitions more broadly, like transitions from primary to secondary, like year 6 to year 7?
Yes. So I think the year 6 to 7 transition is a big one. Just because I think that that's kind of a pivotal time for students when all of a sudden they might need to say, I need more help, especially when it comes to things like self-regulation and organization. And it's harder for them to kind of like grapple with all of that change on top of the fact that they feel like, oh, I don't feel like I have as much of a voice as to what strategies are actually going to work for me in this new time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it kind of does. I mean, I can go through sort of what we do to support those transitions. And one thing we've done a lot of is interact quite a lot with our primary teams. I mean, as a whole school department, we have a lot of interactivity between secondary and primary teams. We know students who are coming to us about a year out at least, and we're having conversations about those students and their interventions across learning support teams. And my role as a whole school director supporting both of those teams helps, us to prepare and provide interventions across phases and to make sure that we're sort of crossing all of those bridges to intervention, as they've been called, as a team. What social supports are needed, what information needs to come across, what academic interventions are needed. There's usually, because it's such a long process, we sort of were working together on, that makes it quite a bit easier. Have I answered the question? I'm not sure if I have.
Yeah, definitely. I think you've talked like about structures. I think that it's really important that you have, like I've seen it because you have a whole school role. You are so involved in making sure that those transitions are really, really smooth. I guess I was thinking more about the student experience. Like, if we want interventions to be really authentic, then it's all about students having voice and agency, and getting to the point where they can tell a teacher, this intervention or this strategy is working for me, or this intervention and strategy is not working for me. How can I get more help? And I think that can be really hard because rapport that a student has will vary from teacher to teacher, from lesson to lesson throughout the day. So it's got to be kind of exhausting for students sometimes, to have to constantly, not code switch, but they have to constantly kind of recalibrate for how that teacher is teaching. It's just one more thing that a student who needs adaptations has to do when they are navigating their way through the school day.
Well, actually, you mentioned relationships obviously being quite an important thing, and I alluded to trust earlier, and that's why having staff working across phases works so well. And we have a wonderful head of a lesson primary who does a lot of work with understanding your neurodiversity and introducing them and talking about neurodiversity. And they've even worked across phases with students as they've come across to help build that understanding, not just about themselves and the environment, but sharing information about that student with teachers and with us and getting us involved in that process. Most recently, there was a student on the spectrum who was working through the Understanding My Diagnosis process in late year 6. And then Miss Claire came across to secondary, worked with one of our secondary teachers to finish off that program. In terms of sharing that more broadly, I mean, I agree with you. I don't know if there's a perfect solution for ensuring that all teachers have that understanding of all students' needs at all times, and they really show that understanding at all times. So it would be extremely challenging for students to have to advocate for themselves in every single class, which is part of the reason why we advocate so much for them and talk about them and, speak to teachers about their needs and how to support them and support teachers in the classroom, because it makes it much easier, I think, to build their understanding, and it puts less pressure on the young person to have to be the sole voice in the classroom talking about their support. They do need our backing and our voice to help amplify theirs.
Yeah, I think that is true. I think so much of learning support's job is to be an advocate, which is like, I feel like that should be part of the job title.
I think so. I always use the word liaison. I mean, I sort of go between, sort of communicate between students and teachers and parents and try to make sure everyone's on the same page. It's a huge job of secondary LS in particular, but also primary. But because secondary LS teachers or SEND teachers have to speak to so many different teachers and so many different stakeholders in the school, it becomes a much bigger part of the job.
That is actually so true. I never considered that, but you're absolutely right. Like, that is one job that would entail so much, like, real, like, authentic engagement with each of the stakeholders. Because if you don't have the parents fully on board and understanding, and the child fully on board, and the teachers fully on board, it really is that is a delicate dance. Todd, did you have anything to add?
No, I exactly the thought you were having, Morgan, about that delicate dance of the engagement of not just the parents and the student, but actually the whole community as well. Because, my daughter, one of the amazing things that's happened to my daughter is that she's been in a class with someone who, in bygone years would potentially not have been in her class. And what that enabled her to do was actually to develop a greater understanding of the world, of other people, and to actually see things very differently. And it struck me when you were talking there that job of the advocate of the learning support team is actually a very much a community job as well, because, we'd like to think that everyone's advanced in their thinking, but I know that unfortunately there are parents who think, oh, I don't want such and such a child in the class with my children because they're disruptive or their behaviour doesn't help everyone else learn or something like that. So I wondered, Ian, what your experience is with that sort of community engagement as well as the student engagement
Yeah,
was,
and I
because
think
yeah, I was just going to say, because I think it can be something that's really beneficial to a community. Not that that's the primary purpose, but it's an amazing secondary or tertiary benefit.
Oh, 100%. And it's why we do some of the things we do with our Neurodiversity Week. And as part of that, we have community outreach. And we had our Understanding ADHD Forum, where we invited parents not just from the school, but across the community to build their understanding as well. And it's vitally important. I mean, I remember not only getting this from parents as well, but as you alluded to, sometimes teachers saying, oh, this child's a problem, they're lazy. And you don't want to hear that from teachers, but it is the reality at times. And all the research available actually speaks to the experience that you were mentioning, Todd, which is that, far from being a negative and a drawback, there's no evidence showing that students with SEND integrating into a mainstream classroom causes those kinds of problems. It's more that it builds empathy, it builds understanding, it builds care, it builds emotional skills in those individuals. And they've experienced working and being with those people, so that when they get into the wider world, it's not something that's a shock or unusual. It's something that they acknowledge as part of human diversity, is neurodiversity.
Absolutely. And I remember thinking when my daughter came home and we had to explain to her that her friend would be learning the rules in a slower way and in a different way, and in her own time, she would get there. I thought, oh no, why did I say that? This will become an endless excuse for my daughter. And yet, her child of, what would she have been at the time, 4 or 5? The absolute compassion that she showed for this. We're quite a stickler as a family for rules. And I thought, she's going to struggle with this, because we talked to her a lot about how important the rules are to being a good member of the team and so on and so forth. And not only did she get it, she kind of took a bit of it onto herself. And I see a huge development in her through befriending someone who did struggle with aspects of school that my daughter didn't. So yeah, I do hope that that's a message that's being echoed, not just in your school, Ian, because that sounds like you've got fantastic community engagement there, but across many schools.
And it's challenging, especially when you're working overseas, because I think I was speaking with a colleague just earlier today. The first class of speech therapists locally in Vietnam was 2 or 3 years ago, and they haven't graduated their first class of occupational therapists. So that groundwork and working with the community to build their understanding is vitally important, because they just haven't had exposure or that experience yet. And I was going to say, even potentially more damaging than other parents having those judgments are sometimes the parents of the children themselves having those judgments, eschewing interventions because they think it's stigmatizing and they think it looks bad and it reflects poorly on them as a parent, is something we see a lot more, particularly in Southeast Asia. Just parents not wanting to engage in interventions, students then conveying that sense of interventions as a negative because they've heard it from their parents. I mean, when your mom and dad says that we don't want this, this is stigmatizing, this is not something that's a good thing, then the children, of course, pick up on that. So they have that sense of an intervention as being something wrong with them.
And where do you start with that one? Because obviously that's so ingrained in the parents' belief system. Where would you start with that, Ian? Because I'm struggling to think how I'd, reverse that vehicle there through that tight spot.
Yeah.
Whereas we see an opportunity to understand the individual better and to find ways in which they can thrive. The parent just sees shame, possibly embarrassment. And I think as well, my experience is that a lot of parents genuinely grieve for the child that they thought they had,
Yeah.
which is still the same child, but they grieve for the child they thought they had and the child that they're uncovering. Is that the right word here?
Oh, I think, yeah, I think that they look at them differently, and like there's something wrong with them. And it is, again, to be fair to the parents as well, that's likely something they were taught as well, or their parents conveyed to them. So it's
Hmm.
very much a learned behavior that's been passed generationally. And how you break that down, there's no quick fix, honestly. It is a matter of years and being sensitive to those individuals' feelings and their experiences, while at the same time providing opportunities to discuss and explain. And you kind of have to introduce things piecemeal and slowly over time, and at all moments, as we all do it as teachers in general, keeping the child at the center, that we all care about this individual, we all want them to succeed. It's the one thing we agree on, even though we want, to do different things at that moment. It's the overlap that we have, is that everything that all of us are doing, and I'll drop that into meetings all the time, even with parents who are adamantly refusing any kind of intervention or any kind of support. We're doing this because we care about the young person. You're doing this because you think you're protecting your child from something. So we both at least have that in common, and that's some common ground we start in. And then sometimes, unfortunately, things escalate because you have an escalation in behaviors and parents are concerned, and then you can use those as opportunities to come back and say, look, we're still here, we want to support you, we want to support your young person. It just takes a long time, because as you can imagine, if this is knowledge that's been acquired over a long period of time, or this is an understanding that's been ingrained from a myriad of sources, undoing that and changing perception is going to take a long time as well. And that sort of relentless caring and understanding is the way forward, but it does take a lot of time.
And would you look to maybe make parent connections across the community, or is that kind of, sort of shuttering them into a sort of silo and saying, look, this is your new group? Because I'm thinking about, in school we talk about modelling something, or giving a scaffold for that unlearning. We'd carefully select ways in which we're going to guide someone. What sort of practical strategies would you suggest, or would other people potentially use?
Well, actually, in our parent forums that we've had parents very much at the center. So a lot of the presenters and have been parents, and some of the people we've highlighted have been parents who give the parent experience and share that with everyone. But at the same time, you can imagine getting a parent to acknowledge that their child needs support and accept that support is one thing. Being able to talk in front of a group is quite another thing, especially again with the stigmatizing of those needs as a culture. So to get a parent to that extent is truly a remarkable thing. And I do have to applaud the parents that we do get to stand up and speak in front of other parents and say, this is my experience. But that's a much harder and a much longer journey.
Interesting.
I think it's really fascinating, Ian. I know that you've actually had members of staff who are neurodiverse also tell their stories during Neurodiversity Week, which has been absolutely amazing as well. It's really amazing to have a staff member who has a PhD tell their story of going through and having ADHD and what it meant to them, and how that's actually added to like how they attack their academic portfolio. I think it's really been fascinating to see how parents are encouraged by that, and it helps destigmatize because they see that the journey is different. I think what's really, really clear is that these interventions have such emotional weight. They can have weight for the student, they can have weight for the parents, and it's a lot to unpack that, because it's not just a simple teaching strategy. It's a teaching strategy that sometimes, yeah, you do have to kind of unpick and unbound from where it comes from, which is really hard sometimes.
Yeah, and those teachers who stood up, I mean, that's a long journey. They talk about their struggles and their difficulties as young people and what they had to endure and go through, which is really powerful. But you can imagine, to get from the point when they were a young person to speaking in front of a bunch of students is you're talking about a 15, 20-year process. And usually you hear in a lot of those stories, and this is sort of looping back to interventions, sort of the supports we put in front of them, is there were people who understood them. There were people who, listened to them, who accepted them, who made them feel seen, and quite a buzzword in education now, made them feel like they belong. And I guess that connects into the wider discussion that we had before about, how do you build neurodiversity across the school as an accepted construct and ideal to make people feel like they belong and that they don't stand out and they're not different and they're not unusual compared to everyone else.
Well, let's take a pause here, listen to the news, and we'll be right back with more.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Are you a teacher who has concerns about your students' low reading levels? Are you also worried disadvantaged students won't be able to catch up? The online reading development program, Dreambox Reading Plus, adapts to a student's skill level, accelerates reading progress, and helps students acquire a wide vocabulary. The patented technology develops reading fluency and supports the transition to increased text complexity from Key Stage 2 to Key Stage 3 and 4, where language and vocabulary are more challenging. You can try the program with a free 4-week pilot today. Search Reading Solutions UK to find their website and request your free pilot.
How do we stop teachers marking books on their kitchen table on a Sunday night instead of wanting to spend time with their family? Is live marking truly cutting-edge practice? What if I told you that I could provide evidence of verbal feedback and its impact on student outcomes? Now, traditional marking, time and time again, is reported as the #1 reason why teachers leave the profession. It trumps behaviour issues and teacher salary. In Guide to Feedback, I share 9 case study schools that demonstrate 9 different ways to provide marking and feedback, all evidenced by student outcomes. Now, not every school will be ready for this, but hopefully you are ready to start your Feed Up and Feed Forward journey.
The Teacher Toolkit Guide to Feedback is out now, and you can get an exclusive 30% discount when you order Teacher Toolkit Guide to Feedback from Bloomsbury.com. Just use the code TTRGTF at the checkout. That's TTRGTF, and it expires 30th of November. Happy reading.
Do you ever wish you could sit down with other teachers and delve into the challenges and opportunities we face? Well, that's exactly what Table Talks at BetUK is all about. Join small roundtable discussions based on your selected topics to share insights, learn from peers, and tackle the big issues in education, all in a sponsor-free environment. This is your chance to connect and collaborate like never before. Be part of the conversation at Bet UK in January 2025. Visit uk.betshow.com to learn more.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
Schools Week focuses on 6 key findings from an annual parent survey. According to the article, most parents said school absence fines would not deter them from taking their child on holiday during term time, with the majority saying it's fine to skip classes to get away. Half of parents say they oppose the policy of fining parents when their child misses school for more than 5 days without good reason or authorisation. Parentkind is calling for the government to review the pricing and marketing of family holidays. The Parentkind survey of all 4 home nations reveals other key findings, which include a quarter of parents considering home education for their children. 2/3 of the parents who have considered homeschooling had children eligible for free school meals, compared with 1/3 from non-free school meal pupils, raising concerns again about the gap between those from disadvantaged backgrounds compared to their non-disadvantaged peers. 1 in 5 parents think that there are too many GCSEs taken by pupils, but only 1/3 of parents thought maths should be studied until the age of 18. 90% of parents thought school reports were useful, and 89% felt this way about parents' evenings too. But support for homework was only at 70%. Nearly 4 in 10 parents said homework causes arguments, which rose to 48% for free school meal eligible pupils. Full details of all the survey's findings can be found on the Schools Week website. An ITV report says the Welsh Government continues to change its position on how to teach English reading. An investigation revealed that a method which has been discredited for decades is being widely used in schools across Wales. The method, commonly referred to as cueing, sees children being told to use cues like pictures or the context of a sentence if they are stuck on an unfamiliar word. The Welsh Conservatives forced a debate in the Senedd based on the investigation, and the government admitted the guidance needed to be clarified, with a spokesperson saying to ITV News that cueing should not be used to tackle unfamiliar words. However, in an interview, the Cabinet Secretary for Education, Lynn Neagle, said cueing could be used to teach reading with phonics as the building blocks as part of a balanced approach. Scientists are concerned that using cueing methods with children whose English skills are already behind when they start school only makes things worse. According to the ITV report, some secondary schools say more children than ever are arriving at school in Year 7 unable to decode words, and that reading ages are below chronological ages. Full details of the report can be found online. In Scotland, the BBC reports that IT failures in Edinburgh meant primary school pupils had access to pornography and videos of executions at public libraries. Filters designed to block inappropriate websites were not activated on PCs accessed using child library cards. According to the BBC, the City of Edinburgh Council believed the issue was resolved earlier this month, until it was discovered that this revised safety measure could also be easily bypassed. All public computers in the city's libraries were taken offline again until the issue could be rectified. Younger pupils are sometimes taken to libraries to use computers during the school day. A parent reported the breach to their child's school, and this was passed on to the council. School-issued iPads were taken away from pupils to check they were secure. A spokeswoman for the City of Edinburgh Council said it was reviewing its security measures. Finally, students at the University of Cambridge have been offered heart screenings after a 20-year-old undergraduate suffered a sudden cardiac arrest. The student collapsed and died whilst hiking in France in 2023, but friends have since raised more than £55,000 to pay for ECGs for hundreds of students. The original goal was to raise £7,000, but now many more will be able to access the test to check for undiagnosed issues. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Jo Fox.
Hello and welcome back. We are continuing our discussion on SEN, and one of the things that we've touched upon at the beginning, but I wanted to circle back to, was the idea of student self-efficacy and self-belief. So we spoke about this in regards to your action research, Ian. So I thought we'd come back to talk about that idea of autonomy that a student must feel, and how they could actually make their intervention more impactful through that self-belief. And I thought that we could also bring in the idea of adaptive teaching, because when interventions and scaffolds for all are available, they're also more feasible, because those students who might have those interventions, they're less on the spot and they might feel less targeted. What are your thoughts on that, Ian?
I might have to be prompted. I don't know if my working memory can hold all of that. I'm going to start with a bit on autonomy first. So for me, when it comes to something like autonomy, and I always just think about myself, and I know that sounds quite self-centered, but students are just younger versions of people. They're not going to be completely different from us as adults. And we want more autonomy. You hear it from teachers all the time, wanting autonomy, wanting the ability to make some choices and decide for yourself. And yet we take away that agency from students all the time with interventions, and we just say, okay, here's the thing that's going to happen. It's something that's being done to them rather than with them, which is something I say often, and I try to remind myself so that I avoid just applying or just putting an intervention to a student. Sometimes you also have to take a setback in order to get forward. The story I mentioned from the outset of letting a student refuse an intervention for a while until we work with them to a point where they're ready to accept that and they accept it on their own. The fact that they did accept it and they did say, no, this is something that I want, made it so much more powerful and so much more effective. Now the next part.
So the next part is when interventions and scaffolds are available for all. So if we are going to have a scaffold that is available, we don't just give it to 4 students in the class. Instead, by making it accessible for all, there are so many more students who can benefit from that scaffold. We also aren't targeting and saying we think less of you, or every single time we're assuming that you need a scaffold. So it's about presenting material and making sure that everyone can benefit from it. But at the same time, there's a lot of agency and choice in saying this is how much help I want, or that I want to access for myself because I want to be challenged. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and we talked about that before, and that sort of nicely brings in actually 2 elements of sort of buy-in into one sort of aspect of adaptive teaching, which is you give the students the ability or the autonomy to opt in and to choose. You also give them the ability to, it'll seem more feasible if they're able to see that, well, it's not just them. Everybody has this adaptation potentially. It's not just me, it's not just for me. And that makes it more less, they stand out less, they seem less different in that way. And there's one more thing I was going to add. Nope, train of thought is gone again. Sorry about that.
No problem. I was just thinking we have spent a lot of time talking about scaffolds and what a good scaffold actually is.
Yeah.
With the idea that it is a scaffold, it is something that can be gradually taken away. I think it's really funny when we give students writing frames, and those writing frames just become something that we use in every single lesson. And you start using the same writing frame in year 7, and it's used all the way through to GCSE, with the idea that it's just something that is always provided to a student, not something that is gradually taken away so that students can then build without them. And there's a lot of research that you did that I thought was really, really fascinating to say, well, what are those good prompts and what are good scaffolds, whether they are written or verbal? What do we do in adaptive teaching that is so special when we move around the classroom and we help students according to what they need in that exact moment? Would you like to just go a little bit further with what that looks like in best practice?
Yeah, I think, well, to say one other thing first, I always found it quite amusing when like you were describing, you give a student a scaffold and they sort of predictably have to take it, they sort of look at it, and the moment that you stop looking, they sort of set it aside and just try to do what everyone else is doing. You end up almost in this tug of war where you're trying to force them to use this intervention, and automatically when you're at that point already, you're sort of fighting a losing battle. You're forcing this upon
Yes.
somebody, and nobody
Yeah.
likes that. Again, children, just as being young people, nobody likes being told what to do. Nobody likes being forced to do something. But if they can see, well, and you talked about this a lot, we've talked about this a lot, Morgan, productive struggle around them, students applying and using the interventions, students, part of self-efficacy, which you mentioned earlier, a huge part is modeling and seeing other people struggle and overcome and succeed. And if they see those interventions applied and used around them, they're more likely to accept and use them themselves. Also, in-class support, I always tell my in-class support staff, don't just hang over the student's shoulder, because once again, you're talking about an intervention that's just meant for them, and they're going to end up resenting it, and it'll actually damage the rapport and the relationship they have with that individual. And you can't just redeploy staff around the school every time that breaks down. So it's important for, also in a similar way to scaffolds, if you have in-class support, that's just not dedicated and stuck to one student as well. They're there to help everyone. It's something I still do in-class support myself, even though I'm told constantly I should stop because I shouldn't be using my time that way. But it's important because what I do is I model going around and talking to all students, interacting with every student in the classroom. I'm not there just to help, this student and this student. I'm not there to sit at their desk. I hated, that's a strong word, but I really disliked it when I was in a classroom and a teacher would say, sit with these students at this table, and it's one table that obviously is, not mixed ability grouping. It's set for all the students that have needs at a single table, and you just work with them. So then when I walk around finally and go to other students, they have the impression as well that I'm there just to help the students who have needs. And if they don't have needs, then they don't need my help. So it's in the same way as you apply those scaffolds and maybe paper-based interventions, it also works for interventions that you apply in terms of people, human resources.
That is so true. I was just thinking the opposite is true as well. So if you are assigning, like if I was to say, Ian, you go and sit at this table, you're going to help these 4 identified target students that I've all clustered together for you. What's really interesting then is that you are not a specialist teacher. So those kids are then missing, if I was a geography teacher, they are missing my geographical expertise. They're not getting that specialist help, which could be really, really useful. And vice versa, the expertise that you have for kids that are not identified but still need certain prompts, that expertise is not being utilized and shared effectively across that classroom. So it should be this idea that it's support for all students. And I think that what you said just right there about modeling, so when you're modeling that adaptive teaching approach, it is so powerful, I think. And it shows like a lot of ownership, that learning is something that every single person in the school, it's not something that we kind of are delineating out and we're each assigned X student. Instead, we are assigned about learning as a whole, and we're assigning learning strategies as a whole. So learning how to learn is one of the things that we are constantly putting out there. So yeah, that's a really, really interesting perspective. Todd, what are your thoughts? Sorry, go ahead, Ian.
No, sorry, I was saying I'm really glad that you mentioned or alluded to separation effect, because what you get there is then just the students never get to interact with the teachers. You're planted at their desk and the teacher circulates to everybody else, and they'll never come back around to those students. One of the things that it also de-skills the teacher, and to say nothing of that, in terms of working with those young people, and they'll never actually get to know them and their needs. I was going to add to that, one thing I'm working on actually is how to make in-class support more effective using the guidance from the Education Endowment Fund. And that's a huge part of it, is avoiding separation effect. In addition to planning in advance and taking the time, as hard as time is to come by, to work with teachers to set up some of those adaptive teaching approaches in advance so you're both on the same page. As they're saying that if you are just turning up to a class cold, I don't know if you've ever had to do this, but I certainly have. If you show up to a class cold, what do? All you're going to do is focus on work completion and on behavior management, and you're not actually supporting learning because you don't know what the learning is. You don't know what the approaches are, and you haven't had any hand in helping to design those. So those are the two main components, both related to adaptive teaching, that I really want to instill when it comes to in-class support and introduce at a whole school level at some point in the near future.
Yeah, do you want to actually expand on the EEF guidance a bit?
I think I addressed a good portion of it, and if I'm missing anything, it's not naturally occurring to me. But those are the two main things that we wanted to do, and they have actually a guide scaffold structure for creating a TA use policy in your school. And so we sort of started with that and adapted it over time and worked on it over a span of a year, slowly involving all elements of in-class support, because it's not just SEN. We have a lot of wonderful TAs in our school. And so we've now begun to involve them in the process and talking to them about some of the main principles, like the separation effect, like planning for adaptations and interventions.
Huh. So I was just going to kind of change tact with a question. And I hope this doesn't feel like it's coming out of left field. But you mentioned this earlier before when you were talking about feasibility and the idea that sometimes something might not be feasible because, let's say, if it's speech to text, because it involves technology bringing out something different, because it is so maybe radically different than what other students in the class are doing, it's less likely to be used. And I was just wondering, we have this kind of swath of kind of new AI adaptive teaching platforms that allow us very easily to kind of fill gaps in prior knowledge. If you're getting the right kind of platform, it can be quite powerful and it can be accessible for all. What do you think, without mentioning any particular platforms, what do you think the future of AI is going to be when it comes to helping us doing this really, really well when we look at adaptations and interventions in the classroom?
Yeah, and I think right off the top, the fact that everyone's using them and it's not stigmatizing makes it easier. Not everybody uses speech to text, not everybody uses text to speech, but almost every student is starting to use AI in some capacity. So it's a very universal technology in that way, which will make it quite feasible. I've also used it to create shortcuts. I don't know if that's the best way to say it, for students who might
Yeah.
have difficulty producing resources and producing text, that they can use it in the classroom setting to create notes for themselves. It might take them a long time to produce on their own, or cutting something down that's an extended reading task so that it's more manageable for them in the classroom, so they can, you know, finish the reading in the same amount of time as their peers. I think there's huge amounts of accessibility and greater acceptability in the use of AI, again, just because it's become so ubiquitous and it's non-stigmatized. So you wouldn't look twice at somebody who said, oh, I'm just going to, run this through an AI chatbot and get the main points of this text, or I'm going to create a study resource. That's what everyone is doing, not just students with SEND. So I can see a huge amount of potential in using that to overcome barriers to intervention. And I've already one practical case of a student who's very, I don't know if severely or profoundly is the right word anymore, dyslexic and dyscalculic. His math scores were at the first percentile, and his spelling was below the fifth, still in like the very low range. And
Mm.
he had a lot of difficulty not do his homework. He'd skip readings. He was just not as engaged, and he found it really difficult. And his response to, as with a lot of students, rather than standing out and looking bad, I'm just going to fail these tasks first before they fail me. I think we've seen that a lot with
Mm.
students over the years who've struggled. I was fortunate enough to have a lesson that was only 2-to-1, him and another student, so I could do a lot of individual support. And it was just when AI was coming out, and there was almost a glint in his eye because he felt like he was sort of gaming the system and that he was getting around by, using these shortcuts. And now, I think this is like 2 or 3 years on, I talked to him about his notes and things like, yeah, I use the chatbot to generate a series of notes that I'm using into flashcards on Quizlet or another program. Sorry, I mentioned one specifically. And then I'm applying that to my revision. So I think there's a huge applicability, and then there's a huge amount of potential in using AI to generate student buy-in to interventions.
Yeah, it's classic low threat as well, isn't it? When you're using the AI, a very, a really strong writer in my class today said to me, "Can I use AI?" And I said, "What for?" And she said, "I want to I want to find some synonyms." And in her head, she thought that using the AI was somehow really naughty and really wrong. And I was like, "You're using it like I'd use a thesaurus. It's absolutely fine." So I think you're right, and the fact that it's an extremely low threat thing, you could admit to it without losing face where your
Yeah.
struggle is, and then you can move forward from there, and it can adapt things specifically to your needs. It's a huge possibility, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it was interesting what you said, though, about it being stigmatizing in almost a different way, and in a
Yeah.
very different way from the way that adaptive technologies were stigmatizing. It's become almost like cheating,
Yeah.
when I think, to be honest, we just have to teach students how to use it properly, and it'll be an
100%.
incredible tool, especially for students with SEND, to access learning and access education more broadly.
Yeah, I was a big cynic at first, and I want to credit Mark Lepard, who's a headmaster in the UAE at British School Al Kebairat. He was the first person, I think, within a few days of its release, to switch me on to the idea that this was something to train students to do, rather than to merely sort of try to catch them out on. I did say to, it was a young girl, I said to her, please never take up a job as a bank robber, because telling the person you think is trying to catch you what you're about to do, not ideal, but in this case, using the AI is absolutely fine. Do you mind if I just take a few things from your bank? Now, it's really interesting. You talked there a little bit about the I think it's called the DIS project, correct? The TA project that the EFF wrote. What we heard in the sort of the break there about this idea of using cluing and scaffolding and prompting, which is what the guidance report suggests for the use of TAs. Where have you personally sort of found the implementation of teaching assistants really successful with students? Because you touched on that, and I don't want to make this about that guidance report, and you have covered a lot that was on it, but I think that small note there in the break about cluing was really interesting to me.
I think it was mentioned before, and maybe this. Tell me if I'm going a bit off piste here. Teachers have subject knowledge. They are the expert of their subject in that particular class. But I've always thought, and I've told more learning support assistants than TAs. My links and my leadership is more over LSAs, or learning support assistants. But I've always said to them, they have expertise in their students. They have expertise in knowing those individuals and understanding them, and they have a benefit of working across a number of lessons actually with some of the same students. So if they've built that positive relationship, they're a conduit for a lot of things. They can make some things happen by the trust and the relationships that they've built with those students over the years. And now you'll see, some of our LSAs, because I don't know if Morgan said this earlier, we have a lot of longevity at our school, which is hugely beneficial, that have been supporting students for 3-4 years. They know them backwards and forwards. And so when they suggest an adaptation, when they bring something to the fore, when they offer them some support, they're more inclined to take it. So while the teacher has all the knowledge about the subject and they have their expertise about their particular area, our support assistants have knowledge and expertise about the students, and they're able to bring that to the classroom. And I think the guidance says that TAs I put it as in-class support more broadly. They complement what the teacher does. They don't replace it. I think that was a key term. They're not replacing what the teacher is doing in any way. That's part of the separation effect. They're adding to it. They're contributing. They're adding something to what the teacher is doing.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I read the report, my initial idea for implementation of that section, of the cluing section, was that they needed to TAs would now need to be responsible for memorizing sort of various metacognitive steps across multiple subjects. And I thought that is a tough job certainly for the money that they're on in the UK. Whereas you've reframed it there as that deep knowledge of the student and not surface level knowledge of multiple subjects, which I think is infinitely more sensible, actually. So I think that's a really, really good point to make. Morgan?
And also, you were saying that they do, because again, the people I work with most closely are in-class support coming from the learning support or SEND department. They do have knowledge of different strategies and approaches, and they do have training in that area that they can apply across those settings. But I think what's most beneficial, because teachers will also be more knowledgeable of misconceptions or misunderstandings, or the difficult approaches and the cognitive work needed for their subject. So even if we have some potentially transferable metacognitive strategies, I think the teachers potentially have an idea of what ones work best for their particular subject, if we're talking about secondary in particular.
I suppose I probably am. I'm a bit stuck. I find it very hard to think about what happens in a primary school beyond sort of Christmas shows and things. That's a limiting factor for me, I'm afraid.
Oh, me as well, I have to say. And I've learned I have to give some attention to my primary colleagues. I'm consistently impressed and amazed by the work that they do day in, day out, and I'm learning so much from them over the last few years as I've worked whole school. And so they've been guiding me more than the other way around, I have to say.
Well, let's take a pause there, gentlemen, and we just have our last little ad break of the episode, and then let's come back and have some good discussion prompts and some concluding thoughts.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Are you a teacher who has concerns about your students' low reading levels? Are you also worried disadvantaged students won't be able to catch up? The online reading development program, Dreambox Reading Plus, adapts to a student's skill level, accelerates reading progress, and helps students acquire a wide vocabulary. The patented technology develops reading fluency and supports the transition to increased text complexity from Key Stage 2 to Key Stage 3 and 4, where language and vocabulary are more challenging. You can try the program with a free 4-week pilot today. Search Reading Solutions UK to find their website and request your free pilot.
How do we stop teachers marking books on their kitchen table on a Sunday night instead of wanting to spend time with their family? Is live marking truly cutting-edge practice? What if I told you that I could provide evidence of verbal feedback and its impact on student outcomes? Now, traditional marking, time and time again, is reported as the #1 reason why teachers leave the profession. It trumps behaviour issues and teacher salary. In Guide to Feedback, I share 9 case study schools that demonstrate 9 different ways to provide marking and feedback, all evidenced by student outcomes. Now, not every school will be ready for this, but hopefully you are ready to start your Feed Up and Feed Forward journey.
The Teacher Toolkit Guide to Feedback is out now, and you can get an exclusive 30% discount when you order Teacher Toolkit Guide to Feedback from Bloomsbury.com. Just use the code TTRGTF at the checkout. That's TTRGTF, and it expires 30th of November. Happy reading.
Do you ever wish you could sit down with other teachers and delve into the challenges and opportunities we face? Well, that's exactly what Table Talks at BetUK is all about. Join small roundtable discussions based on your selected topics to share insights, learn from peers, and tackle the big issues in education, all in a sponsor-free environment. This is your chance to connect and collaborate like never before. Be part of the conversation at Bet UK in January 2025. Visit uk.betshow.com to learn more.
Hello and welcome back. We're just coming up on the end of our show on SEN, and I thought that one of the things that we could do is just look at some quotes as discussion prompts and then come to some closing thoughts about everything that we've discussed. Todd, you had a few different quotes that you had brought out that have just been tweeted that you thought just might be a fun way for us to kind of have some reactions considering everything that we've just discussed. Would you like me to read one, or would you like to delve into it?
I'll read them both, and then I think we can maybe all react. And I suppose this is a bit of a TMZ, a bit paparazzi, but I'll read them and then we'll get the reaction. But I think it would be good to address them. So this is from I believe it's pronounced Musin Ismail, who's a leader of a large chain of schools in the UK, or part of a leadership team. And it's a really interesting quote to me. I've come to the conclusion that some parents seek a label for their child, usually for poorly behaved boys, because I'm terrible at saying this word, I've seen it written down 1,000 times, assuages the guilt of their poor lifestyle choices and liberal parenting decisions. Sadly, there is an entire industry ready to take advantage of this, along with a body of activists willing to support their cause. And I know what we said about working memory, but I thought I'd follow with this from Tom Bennett as well. By far, the best way to tackle SEN support is to begin by ensuring schools are calm, safe, structured environments with high expectations of dignity and clear boundaries, consequences, and reasonable accommodations. And there's more, but I'll pause at that point because I think that's probably the key element there of those two quotes. I don't know if anyone wanted to jump in, but I think they're really fascinating points from two people who, have been involved in great success in education, and yet I'm not sure those points would chime with everyone, or perhaps they would. I'm not sure. What's your first response into those? That's the TMZ
Um,
moment, I'm afraid.
yeah, I didn't know at first what you meant by TMZ, and then I remembered it was a show. I'm sort of, not very media literate. But yeah, I mean, label seeking is something that we see all the time. And as I alluded to actually earlier, we see a lot more label avoidance. But there are some parents that do try to seek labels to explain or to, create a reason or a rationale. And there are others who try to avoid them for the same reason, to avoid that rationale and avoid that explanation of that difficulty. Again, I'm not sure if I answered that in its fullest.
Yeah, no, I think you did. And I think that the first one, I often find myself nodding at Musa Ismail's tweets, but I did find that one a little challenging. But you're right, I've certainly encountered that. And I suppose it speaks to that idea of overdiagnosis and the from my perspective, and this is not my specialism, Ian, so forgive me, but there is, of course, a danger that that overdiagnosis could occur because as stigma's removed, it becomes more acceptable to test for more parents and so on and so forth. And perhaps in time there will be a rebalancing, but I wouldn't want to comment on that because I'm not really in it enough to know whether we're at that tipping point, and I don't understand the data sets well enough to make a sort of informed judgment there.
Yeah.
But I can certainly recognise what you've described there and what Musin is describing.
Well, in terms of labels, and maybe I can't speak more broadly to that, but and certainly my own thinking on it, and we've actually redone our own internal guidance for how do we pursue diagnoses of things like ASD and ADHD in Vietnam, which is really hard to do because we just don't have the specialists out here. But it is possible, and we can pursue it. But when do we do that? And it kind of links more broadly to the conversation we're having, and it's when it's in the best interest of the young person. If we think that a label or we think that a diagnosis will help them in some way, help their understanding, help their parents' understanding of them, and maybe develop a deeper understanding relationship from their part, that's when we'd pursue it. If we see a situation where the only thing that could potentially arise is conflict and negativity and stigma, even if it's just at that moment, and it's something we might be looking to improve in the future, it might not be worth pursuing a label or a diagnosis. But again, sometimes it is a means to an end. I mean, the exam systems doesn't help. Seeking diagnosis can often unlock things like additional time, which is sought by parents all the time. So, there are less than altruistic reasons for seeking diagnoses, and there's also altruistic reasons for not seeking diagnoses.
Yeah, and that will get a huge response on Twitter because it's a fairly reactionary platform. But it's interesting what you've said in a very in a very measured manner there, that actually there's elements of truth on both sides of that statement. And I think it's a really interesting point to have in the conversation. And at the second one, I think is probably. It will probably still get the same reactions for the same reason I've just mentioned, but clear boundaries, high expectations, structured, calm and safe, expectations of dignity. I assume Tom means for all there, not just the student, but for the people around the student. It's what every child, especially SEN children, need to flourish. That seems to me to echo a lot of what we've said in this conversation.
I think it's really interesting just because when we look at the issue of like over and under diagnosis, I often think of Dr. Martin Bloomfield. He does a lot of work. He got his PhD, but he often tells his kind of origin story as someone who was dyslexic, who had ADHD. But he said one of the big things that stops so many young people is the fact that there isn't universal testing, and that the testing measures differ geographically from region to region. So there are students that would be undiagnosed in some places and maybe overdiagnosed in others, or diagnosed but not by the same degrees of measurement. So what you might find in Germany is not going to be the same as what you find in Canada or the UK, for instance. But also the fact that parents have to act as advocates, there's cultural stigmas, all kinds of things can lead to over and under diagnosis, when in fact there should be more universal measures, and it should be normalized for assessments to be happening, and they should be happening more frequently, which thank goodness they are. I think with all that in mind, when I unpack it, I just think of the relief that I felt as a parent when I finally had my own child assessed. And all of a sudden, it was like I could see my child for the very first time. The label wasn't a label, but reading the report was so powerful, because all of a sudden, all of these small, small things, they were like clues in a mystery game. And all of a sudden, the mystery was revealed. And this was my kid. All of these things that I thought had just been oddities, or things that I couldn't understand or that I couldn't help him with, all of a sudden they were laid there, and I could finally see him. And I think that's what's really, really interesting about this idea of diagnosis and labeling. It's not so much that a student is living with a label, it's the fact that you're able to use that label as a lens to see that child with. And that's kind of just been my experience, which it's always surprising. It can be hard, but it's definitely so worthwhile, which is what Ian's job, that's what makes Ian's job so special and important, I think, because it really helps bring all of these things together for a child.
Absolutely. And I remember feeling exactly the same way when my nephew was diagnosed. I always say, and I have to be careful with this because people can get mixed up, it enabled me to become kinder to him, all of us to be kinder to him. And that's not to say that we were being cruel previously, but that level of understanding that we had enabled us to see exactly where he needed us. And he's now studying to be an engineer in his final year. And I suspect that he would have done far worse had we not been given that list of sort of ingredients, if you like, for how to put it all together for him and how to understand what he was trying to do. And he's going to go on and be an amazing, functional member of society who, provides real value for others and for himself. So that's what that document allowed us to do, and I'm sure many, many others.
And those are perfect circumstances for diagnoses, where it does build that understanding and actually seeing someone in many respects for the first time and really understanding them. And this is building on, Todd, what the other quote that I think you raised about acceptance and belonging and understanding. And I think where diagnoses and where information about students and labels can be beneficial is also in helping teachers see their students and understanding them and building relationships and genuinely applying strategies and applying adaptations and applying interventions because they know who they are. And that's actually one of the benefits I have working with my team, is they really know and they really see those students. They really care about them, and you can see the students and feel cared for when they come to our space in Skills for Learning, even when they don't have to, even in their lunch hour, even in their spare time, because it's a place they know they belong and they feel cared for. And we're trying to extend that more broadly through some of the measures that we mentioned before, but it's always going to be a difficult process, and we're not quite there yet.
Oh, it feels like we have had a really wide-ranging conversation. And I have to say, there's so much dynamic space in this conversation. There are so many amazing things that are happening in schools. And I feel like there's more recognition that we can do so much for students. So with that in mind, I'd just like to thank you both for the depth of this conversation and the interesting avenues it's taken. Ian, it is so wonderful to have you on as a guest, and I hope that we can have you on again soon.
Thank you for having me, and I apologize again for my working memory. And actually, on the last question, I didn't remember it. I read back to it to make sure that I'd caught it. So, yeah, Thank you for having me, and apologies for my occasional lapses.
Next time I'm going to ask you a 10-part question, so you just wait. You just wait for it.
Oh, that's
Morgan,
my very definition of torture.
Morgan, we've talked about this. Not everyone's brain operates at Morgan speed. In fact, maybe nobody's.
I'm going to talk very, very fast, I promise.
Yeah.
Thank you guys both so much. It's been lovely having you on for the Friday Lunchtime Show, and I hope that everyone has an absolutely amazing weekend. Goodbye, gentlemen.
Morgan.
Goodbye, everyone. Bye.
Thank you ever so much, Ian. Bye-bye. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.